Okay.
Good afternoon. This is wildlife biologist Eric Orr from the Hampshire Fish and Wildlife. This is Monday, August 12th, 2019. This morning I was reading through one of my diaries from 2005, so not that long ago. And one thing I had kind of forgotten about was for many years, for a decade then, and then it's still happening today, each year, late summer, late August, mid to late August, wildlife biologists from across New Hampshire and many other states here on the eastern seaboard actually do a nut count. So we had plots that we set up throughout New Hampshire, in all four regional areas, with oaks and beech nuts and other nut-bearing trees, and we would basically examine the trees for whether there are, for instance, oak trees, acorns or not, or beech nuts are not, in white oak and red oak and beech nuts trees in New Hampshire. And of course, south of us, where there's more hickory nuts, they probably do hickory nuts. So wildlife biologists from the Hampshire Fish and Game would do an annual nut survey, and I took part in that for a number of years, and I'm quite certain it still is going on now. And why would we do that? Acorns, beech nuts, and food like that is very important for our wildlife. Bears, when they have good feed, go into the winter in better condition. They produce more cubs the next summer. So knowing the food availability for our wildlife gives us a sense on how well they might survive the coming winter, how many cubs the female bears might produce. So there's a lot of information that is important to managing our fish and wildlife that the biologists, the wildlife biologists here in New Hampshire have been doing for decades. As I'd mentioned before, we went from 1,000 bears when I first started working with black bears to over 5,000 now, about 5,500. Our wild turkeys, I mentioned the other day that it takes a village to raise turkeys. Yes, it does. Turkey biologist Ted Walsky does this same survey because certain turkeys eat acorns and eat beech nuts, and it helps them get through the winter. And in the spring, when the snow goes, that's some of the first things they eat. So our turkeys went from, 25 in 1975 to, 40+ thousand a day. So wildlife biologists from across New Hampshire work for decades to help restore the wild turkeys. And our deer numbers, we've gone from 40,000 deer in the early 1980s to 120,000 today. So keeping track of information like how many acorns and how many beech nuts are out there, and also we do surveys of raspberries and blackberries, choke cherries, American cherries. So every year it's actually the bear biologist, Andy Timmons, that is now collecting the data, and we use this to help manage our wildlife. And the wildlife biologists in New Hampshire have been very successful over the last 40 years to restore and bring back wildlife in numbers never seen since before colonial times. So yeah, one of my jobs as a wildlife biologist was to count nuts.